Thank you so much for having me here today. I'm very excited to be talking about my research. I do study how white people talk about race, which is a fascinating subject and enabled me to do a lot of eavesdropping, which I really enjoyed. So what we're going to do in here today is I'll tell you why I started looking at this research, how I approached it, and then I'm going to give you a chance to do some eavesdropping as well. And I'll show you some bits of conversation, and you'll help me figure out kind of what you think is happening in these conversations. So if you would keep your cell phones away. You in the back, I see you. Cell phones away, so you can help me do some of this work while we're in here together. Okay, so what I was very interested in is what we accomplish when we talk about race. So not necessarily what we think and feel deep in our hearts, which is what we're often trying to get at when we look at people's race talk, right? When you say that, what do you really mean, right? That's what we often study. That's wonderful and a very valid line of thought. But I was interested in, kind of regardless of what you mean, what do you do when you talk the way you talk? Right? What does it accomplish? And I also want to look at talk as a truly interactive thing. We tend to study the way people talk about race by doing one-on-one interviews. And most of us, in most of our life, don't spend a lot of time in one-on-one interviews. That's not really where we talk. So I wanted to look at a sort of a different combination of situations. All right, so what got me thinking was this wonderful book by Bonilla Silva. Came out in 2003. It's very skinny and easy to read, so you should pick it up and just keep it with you, read it on the subway. And he looked at how white people talk about race by looking at survey data and by doing hundreds of interviews with white participants throughout the country. So we have a lot of really interesting information that came out of his work. One thing he found, and the survey data over and over again confirms, is that white people are much more likely to say that racism doesn't matter in America today. Quick caveat, my research is from before the Trump campaign and presidency. A lot of this stuff is changing rapidly. My hope for the second phase is to replicate what I did under Obama's presidency, now under Trump, and see what's different. So, you know, it used to be you could talk about race talk, there was like a 20-year time period where it was very stable, and now it's changing very fast. So some of this was really true 2 years ago. I'll mention moments where I think it's shifting. White people now are slightly more likely to say that race is a problem in our country than they were a year or 2 years ago, but they're still less likely to than people of color, so it still holds. Right? He also found that whites tend to talk about race in a way that gives the impression that we are race neutral, right? And we'll look at specific phrases in a minute. All right. What we find is that whites are very patterned. They use very particular phrases and sentences over and over and over again. And this is kind of regardless of who we talk to, educational level, economic level, different parts of the country, we'll see the same phrases being said, almost like there's a script, right? Now that's not too shocking because talk is very scripted anyway. Like a lot of the ways we talk are patterned. I'll give you an example. On the subway platform, the train platform out on the island this morning, someone said to me, "Oh, it's kind of warm today." And I said, "Yeah, there was ice on my car yesterday, and now today's so warm I didn't button my coat." I get to campus today, I see a colleague of mine, and I say, "It's kind of warm today." And she says, "Yeah, there was ice on my car yesterday." Right? Talk is patterned. That just happens with talk, right? So we're not surprised that race talk is patterned, right? We're not totally surprised by that. What we are a little bit surprised by, and if you're a sociologist, you're a little bit delighted by the fact that the way we talk about race is patterned and the stuff we say is often untrue or very strange, right? That makes it more interesting to me, right? I'm not so interested in the pattern way we talk about weather because it's kind of obvious, right? But you can imagine if I said to my colleague, "It's kind of warm today," and she said, "I don't even wear shoes when it's warm out." You'd be like, "Huh, that's strange," right? What a weird thing to say. That's what happens with race. We have these strange things we say. So that's what I wanted to look at. So I'll give you some examples. You may be familiar with these, right? Whites have a tendency to claim they can't see color or that they don't care what color people are. Are you familiar with that? Raise your hand if you've heard something like that before. Yeah, we see that a lot. Sometimes a phrase like this, "I don't care if you're purple, blue, or green, doesn't matter to me," right? Pretty common way of talking about race. Why is this not true? Remember I said race talk is often untrue or strange. Why do you think it's not true? Okay, so it references a hypothetical situation that's impossible. You're not likely to stumble upon a person who's purple or green. All right, good. So the purpose of this, we believe, getting back to kind of what people mean, what they're trying to do, right, is to really avoid looking at racism, not to avoid looking at race. So it is a weird thing to say because it says you can't see race, when what you really want to say is you can't see racism, right? So it's weird in that way. Right? And plus, look, we've studied it. Americans are really good at identifying each other's race. We can see it. We're really good at it. In fact, we have lots of clues, right? We have physical features, social features. We can use your name, the side of town you live on. We can figure out what race you are. It's a little trickier in Brooklyn, right? But if you go to Wyoming, you're going to be right, like 100% of the time, right? We're good at that. We can figure out what race people are. So it's simply not true that we can't see it. It's simply not true that we can't define people using racial characteristics. We're not likely to see someone who's purple, blue, or green, and it's absolutely not true that you wouldn't care, right? If I showed up and I was purple, you'd be on your phone like, right? Dean Gray is purple, like there's some crazy stuff going on at SFC, like you would definitely care, right? So this is strange, and it's not true, right? A lot of our pattern ways of talking have that same problem. Whites have a tendency to claim that they have lots of friends or close associates who are people of color, right? That phrase, some of my best friends are black, right? It was said so often it becomes this like running joke in our culture, right? You almost can't say that seriously anymore, but you hear it all the time. What Bonilla Silva and some other researchers did is a white person said, oh yeah, I know lots of black people. Maybe like, okay, what is their last name? Right? And most people are like, I actually don't know, right? It's the security guard in my building. I don't know his last name, right? Or they'd say, when is the last time you had a person of color in your home who wasn't a worker? Never, right? When's the last time you shared a meal with a person of color in a social setting you weren't required by work? Never, right? So again, people are saying it, but when we scratch a little bit, we find underneath that claim, it's simply not true. This is weird to me. Why are we saying things that aren't true over and over and over again? How about this one? Claiming not to be racist before expressing an opinion related to race. Have you heard that one? Right? I'm not racist, but, right? I hear it all the time. I teach the class about race here on campus. My students will say it, right? You hear it all the time. I'm not racist, but, right? Again, very strange. Maybe true, I don't know in each individual case, but very strange, right? It's kind of like if I said, I'm not a serial killer, but I'd like you to come over to my house for dinner, right? Now it's creepy, right? Now it's really, really weird. Why would you say that? Like, don't say that before you invite me over. It's scary, right? The fact that we say this first is strange. So we have all these ways of talking that are kind of glitchy when we really look at them. Another one that they found in the research is that whites tend to bring up racist white people they know, or white people who say or do racist things, as a way to sort of compare themselves, right? Like, my grandmother says the N-word all the time. I would never do that. Now, in one-on-one research, we find that this statement gets made, and the researcher sort of accepts it, right? Like, okay, and that's the end of it. In my research, and this is what we're going to focus on today, this is the beginning of something, right? So interview research showed this is about making yourself look good compared to a more racist person. My research is going to show it actually serves an additional purpose when we're doing it in a group conversation. So we're going to not worry about all the rest of that today. We're just going to focus on this piece, okay? Okay, so how do I record people talking about race? Right, I told you I wanted to eavesdrop, but that can be awkward. I'm not like in coffee shops like, oh, are you talking about race? Be a little louder, can you lean this way, right? That's awkward. I wanted people talking about race with each other, so I didn't want like a public speech. I didn't really want truly intimate conversations about race. I wanted something that was sort of semi-public, something where the speakers knew they had some kind of audience, some people who were listening. Because what I'm really interested in is how do we intentionally navigate these conversations. Right? So when we have to have sort of public conversations on a train or conversations in a mixed setting where you don't already know people very well, those sort of semi-public situations where you're aware people are listening and you have some control over your contribution in the conversation. That's what I was interested in. So I decided I would just bring together groups of white people and ask them to talk about something that I thought would bring up some issues of race. All right? That's what I decided to do. So I did focus groups with a twist. I don't know how well you can see this. It's just a sense of the breakdown. I had 17 women, 17 men, various different ages, different kinds of jobs, different economic levels. I just wanted kind of a mix of people, right? I didn't want to be too pushed by one type of person. We'll look at political ideology breakdown in a little bit. This is kind of who was in my groups. I did 8 groups, and I considered them self-moderated, where I brought people together. It was like 4 to 7 people in each group. I gave them some guiding questions, but then I sat way across the room and like didn't look at them, like pretended I wasn't there. So they knew they were being recorded, right? They knew I was in the room. They knew they were in a research study. So I would expect them to be kind of intentional about their contributions to the conversation. But I wasn't participating. So those of you who have taken research methods, raise your hand, you've been in a research methods class? All right, fantastic. So you know for interviews, interviewers ask probing questions, right? You say something interesting and I say, tell me more about that, right? I didn't want that. I didn't want the conversation to be guided by me. Because if I guide the question, we don't really know what people would have said without me. So I wanted people to talk amongst themselves. So I gave them some guiding questions. This first set, to recruit into my study, I told them it was a conversation about politics. I thought if I told them it was a conversation about race, I'd get a weird self-selection of, I don't know who intentionally tries to have a big conversation about race in this country. So I thought politics, kind of neutral, brought people in. So I ended up putting a little politics in here to make good on my word. But there's some race in here too. Now if you look at this set of questions, you'll see people could dodge the question of race altogether, right? They could talk a lot about it, but you also could not talk about it at all. So if I said to you, in what ways, if any, do you think Barack Obama's race matters to most people? How do you dodge the race question? What's your answer going to be? What's that? It doesn't matter, right? You can basically say that today. In what ways does it matter to you? It doesn't matter, right? You could say that to all of these. I don't care, it doesn't matter, I don't think it matters, I don't think it matters. And you could shift gears. You could be like, what really matters in this country is education, right? And you could talk an hour, no more race, right? So I wanted that to be an opportunity so that they would talk about race to the extent that they wanted to. And again, it's not reflecting my own focus, right? But I needed to be able to say something about this study when I was done. So I couldn't have them dodge race the whole time, because then what am I going to say? So I had a second set of questions. After about 45 minutes of talk, I gave them the second set, pushing them a little more toward talking about race and giving them less opportunity to dodge the topic. You sort of have to grapple a little bit more with these questions. And again, that was just to protect myself as a researcher so that at the end of my study, I had something I could write about. It would be fascinating to say, when you ask people to talk about race, they avoid it, but you can't write a whole article about that. So a second set of questions just to make sure that in the end of the day, I got some conversation about race. And I was also hoping that this would be a little bit of a moment of self-reflection. I was worried if I got a bunch of white people together to talk about race, and they said a bunch of really racist things to each other, that I had put something really bad into the universe, right? I didn't really want to be responsible for that. So I wanted them to pause for a minute and think twice about their contribution. It was just this kind of little ethical check that I wanted to put into my study. In the end of the day, they talked a ton about race the whole time. So I didn't need to worry about this. All right, so what we're going to focus on today is kind of how we talk when we're talking about whites who say racist things, right? That's the bit of my study that we're going to focus on. There's other stuff I found, but we're not going to talk about it today. All right, so this was that last bit, right? My grandmother says the M-word all the time, and I would never do that. That's the kind of thing I was looking for in my study. All right, so give this some thought. I had 8 focus groups, 34 participants. The previous research told me that white people sometimes say things like that bit about the grandmother in order to personally appear less racist. So how many times would you think I heard this? 8 groups, 34 people. Think everyone said it? What do you think? Give me some guesses. All right, maybe 20 times? Can we say more or less? More than half of the people or half of the groups? Both? More than half of the groups, maybe. So I had 8 groups, so I would expect maybe 4 times this came up. Okay. More, you think? Okay, well, you saw my discussion questions. Think that's going to bring this up a lot, or hard to say? Okay, so there was like opportunities that maybe would pull a little more of this out. All right, so some reasonable guesses. All right, wait till you see this. 86 times! 86 times! I was shocked. It's like 10 times an hour. I was totally blown away by this. I did not expect this to happen, right? I know, how do you even? I thought that maybe each white person, like the max, each white person would do it once, right? Once say, look, I'm not racist because, look, I know a racist, this guy, whew, right? Everybody would do it once, get a little street cred, right? And then move on. That's what I expected. That's what the literature led me to believe. They did it 86 times, right? And just to show you by group, some groups certainly did it more. So the columns are the separate focus groups. Some groups did it more. Interestingly, the 2 groups that had only 3 references, those groups had an explicitly racist group member who said all sorts of crazy things, right? Things I could not believe they were saying in my presence. So since that group had a racist, they didn't mention a whole lot of other racists. Maybe they were being polite, I don't know. But those groups had kind of a very weird dynamic. Everybody else has a good number of references, right? Some really high, but every group did this. Yeah.
Is it possible that people are generally guarded until one person opens their mouth and then others join in?
Yeah, well, we're going to take a look at exactly what the joining in looks like, and it does seem to have a little bit of that snowball effect. So it's a good point, and you're going to get a chance to see it. So here you also get a sense of the political breakdown of my groups. They were not designed to be one politics or another. For my purposes here, it's if the participants in the study identified it as racist. So it's not my definition, it's if the participants said it was racist, that's what we're counting. It goes in here because what I'm interested in is what does the group do when someone says, here's a racist thing, right? What does the group do? Whether it's true or not, that's not my problem, right? What does the group do? So we had, 86 times where someone in the group said, here's a time I heard some racism or observed some racism, and then what does the group do with that information, right? Now the previous literature would lead me to believe the groups would say, okay, you're less racist than that guy. Like that's the full extent we knew about this. I find that there's a whole lot that happens beyond that. All right. So let's do a quick rundown, shall we? All right, 86 times. They mentioned 8 racist parents, 3 racist grandparents, 1 racist adult son, 8 other racist family members, such as cousins, aunts, and uncles, 3 stories about times they worried the comments of their small children made them seem racist, 4 racist friends, 8 racist neighbors, 4 interactions with racists at work, 15 specific racist individuals they didn't know but heard about. I'll give you some examples here. 18 unique references to the racist worldviews of subpopulations like Southerners. I would count that as 1 reference. Kids in suburbs out by the airport, I don't even know what that was about, but that would be that kind of thing. And 6 racist institutions, such as the media, movies, American leadership throughout all history. Those are the kind of things that I flagged. What I was looking for was if the participant explicitly said, oh, this is racist, and then told me what it is. Okay, I could code that. Or if they said something and then the next guy said, oh, well, in that example of racism, and nobody corrected them, right? So either I heard it directly out of the mouth of the participant or another participant verified that they also heard it as a claim of racism. That was good enough for me. So those are the kind of 2 things I was looking for. Sort of a member checking if you study social science research methods. All right, so lots of references from lots of different parts of life, right? Again, much more than I was expecting to see. Okay. Now remember, what did Bonilla Silva tell us was true about whites in general? Right? Do they think there's a lot of racism that matters in the world? No, right? Whites will say racism is not a problem. And then they will tell you about 86 racists that they know, right? So what on earth is going on? How can you hold both of those experiences? Right? I'm going to show you how they do it, right? They fundamentally believe that racism isn't important, that it's not really impacting people's lives. Yet in their own life experience, they have many examples of individuals that hold clearly racist views, sometimes very explicit racist views, sometimes stuff that's more coded and a little more subtle. But a lot of this stuff was really blatantly clear. So how can both of those things be true, right? That was my job, and that's what your job will be when we look at some people actually talking. All right, so just so you can have shared language with me as we move forward, what I did is the first unique mention of a white racist, so the first time you mention your racist cousin, that's my initiating action. That sort of starts that part of the conversation, right? And then there'll be what I call the negotiation phase, where people respond however they're going to respond, right? Now, they could not respond at all. They could respond a whole lot. I don't know. That's the negotiation. And then there'll be some kind of outcome. What's the sort of end result of all this talking? Right? That's what I was looking for. So my whole project is sort of using those 3 phases as the way I process the data. All right, so just fair warning, when you eavesdrop, you do hear all sorts of things, right? I actually didn't even give you the really, really bad stuff, but I didn't edit out bad language. I didn't edit out offensive claims. There are things that are going to be up here that are words I wouldn't normally say at my job. And there's words that I won't say at all. So I'll do my best to kind of censor myself, but you'll see the raw humanity up on the screen. I do apologize for the extent to which that is offensive. All right, so we're gonna listen in a little bit on a conversation. Okay, so here's the initiating action. Kim tells the group about her classic, stuck in his ways, a-hole racist grandfather, right? Again, this was not subtle. I had no trouble being like, oh, she thinks he's racist. All right, so ding, we got an initiating action. The original research would lead me to believe she only said that so she could say, I'm not that racist. Well, what does she say next? All right, I was going to argue with him. I'm not that racist, right? But I realized, just forget it. He's a crotchety old man who's going to die of the gout or something. Okay. That's Kim's story about her white racist relative. All right. The group at this point does not have to respond, right? They could say, okay, sorry your grandfather's a jerk, right? I'm glad you're not that racist. They don't have to have a big conversation about it, right? This is what they do instead. Okay? So Ellen says, there's a big difference between our parents and our grandparents. Our parents don't think that way at all. They're actually pretty open-minded when compared to how their parents raised them. So Ellen is no longer talking about that one grandfather, right? What has Ellen done here? She's what? Okay. She switched off that one guy. Okay. And what are we talking about instead? Is there another? Oh, she made it much more general, right? And she is blaming it on something. Steve, do you have? Okay, yeah, she's gone from this one individual case to this category of people. And what category does she think might be prone to racism? Older people, right? She says, look, this is about age or generation. It's older people. So she went from this one instance to saying, oh, well, racism is because the older generation is more racist, right? Now, again, she didn't have to make that move for us, but she did. Yeah? What's that? Right here, right? She's saying, well, the big difference between, your grandfather. Yeah, so we're pulling away a little bit from this instance of racism to this bigger conversation. All right. The next participant says, look, God love him, but my uncles say racist things. My uncle was sending around this email, and at the bottom in his signature underneath his name, he had Obama, and it was an acronym, and it said, one big-ass mistake, America. And I was like, oh my God, that is what my uncles are like, so against anything different. Now again, in terms of the research methods, you do not have to believe that this signature line is racist, right? She believes it is. And that's what we're doing here, right? If a participant identifies something as racist, what happens next? Okay, so she's saying that's an instance of racism. What is the group going to do with this information? So that you know, all of these participants are approximately the same age. So what just happened to our generation-based theory of racism? What's that? All right, why is that? Yeah. All right, so in this negotiation that we have going on, we have a point of agreement, but then we have a point of disagreement, right? So they're actually actively engaging in this conversation. Well, where does racism really come from? Is it generation or not, right? And that's what our groups then go on to do over and over and over again. An initial story, some conversation about that character, an additional character, some conversation, and we figure out what factors might explain it. So what this group did is, we see Kim jump back in and say, well, maybe it's that they watch Fox News. We see Dan jump in and say, look, it's the Republicans, right? They put that message out over and over. People can't know what's real and not real, right? So now we have generation as a possible explanation. What are other explanations? Media exposure, right? And political ideology. Now we have 3 possible understandings of where racism came from, right? So when we mention these white racists that we know, right? Turns out it's not only about giving ourselves a favorable point of comparison. It's about doing something else, right? Something pretty big and complicated. And I saw my groups do this over and over and over again. So here's another example, right? Beth is telling a story about trying to find out what her hard-nosed Republican father thought about Obama. So my father said something like, it was very ambiguous, but the point was just like, well, I don't want to be offensive, but, and like, I'm sitting there looking at him like, my eyes are bugging out. His family is quite racist, and my mom's family is from the South. They say the N-word like all the time. So we don't really know what her dad was going to say here, but clearly Beth thinks he's going to say something racist. She identifies that his family is racist, and her mom's family might be racist, right? So we got a whole lot of people here, right? Just so that we're clear, and again, what's great with eavesdropping is the next person often clarifies, right? So Lynn says, oh, he was claiming but not saying that he wouldn't vote for Obama because he was black? Interesting. I was like, thank you for summing up the subtext of my previous quote. All right, so that's our situation. What do you think our group does next? Talk about Obama? Maybe. We're trying to figure out what to do with our racist. All right, so now the South might be the reason we have racism, right? People from the South. All right, did you have another suggestion? Okay. All right, so we know we're talking about a president, so political ideology might pop up again. All right, so we have people in the South. She's talking about fathers, so sometimes that goes back to the age thing, right? Beth clarifies, look, my dad's a decent guy, right? He's a smart, decent guy, but his family, like his brothers, like his older brothers and stuff are very, I don't know if they're specifically racist, but they have their ideas that they've kind of just let go. It's how they are for years and years and years, and they've never been challenged, right? So what do you think Beth is pushing us toward as the explanation here? What's that? Okay, so she's thinking it's this older generation stuck in its ways, right? We're back to that explanation. We see that explanation a lot. Lynn says, well, that is how it goes now. I don't think there are many people outside of certain circles who are openly racist anymore. All right, what did Beth just tell us about both sides of her family? That they are openly racist, right? And Lynn's conclusion from that information is, well, no one's really openly racist, right? Beth says, probably not. Kind of weird, right? It's a weird moment where we've decided that the fact that all of her relatives are openly racist is just certain circles, right? So they gotta grapple with this a little bit more. They're not done yet. Lynn says, it's so funny that you're telling this story about your dad. It reminds me of my dad so much because he also grew up in a very racist family and he struggled with that. So we're back to that idea, it's the older generation, right? It's the older generation. Yeah, where we're headed with this, a little bit of a spoiler alert, is how we kind of come to terms with these people as not being the bad guys. So there's definitely a little like breadcrumbs in that for sure. Okay. So we've come to this conclusion that it's dads, right? The older generation. And then the most remarkable thing happens, right? Another group member realizes and points out that Beth and Lynn are not the same age. And in fact, Lynn is the same generation as Beth's dad. Oh, that's a problem, right? We had this pretty handy generational argument going. It's not gonna work, right? Lynn can't quite handle this information. She said, I was going to say it's a generational thing. It still is, to some extent. It still is a generational thing depending on what part of the country you're from. So she goes back and pulls that Southern history that's in Beth's family, right? So it's Southern history, because Beth's dad is too young to be a racist, but he's Southern. You can be Southern, then you don't have to be old. So it's a combination of those two things that explains racism, right? So they are doing a ton of work here, a ton of work to kind of make sense of these racists and their families, right? We see how that works? Okay, so we're not gonna go line by line through a bunch more, but I did wanna give you some other examples. One group tells a story about the time their toddler saw a black man at Walmart and shouted, look, Mom, it's Bill Cosby. She's like, I was really afraid that made us look racist. So what do you think the group says? He's not from the older generation, he's a toddler. So what's going on? Yeah. Right, he's so young, he's innocent, right? He's too young. So it turns out, okay, old people are racist and young people are racist, right? That explains it, right? He was only a baby, right? They also say, and he just doesn't have a lot of experience with people of color. He's very socially isolated from people of color, right? Because they lived in a very white town. She's like, he watched Bill Cosby on TV. It's the only person of color he'd ever seen before. So that's where that comes from. The group decides that's fine, that this combination of social isolation and being young, that's where his racism comes from, and that it's so sort of marginalized, like he's so young, it probably doesn't even really count, right? That's where they kind of get on that one. All right, someone says he's a racist aunt who says inappropriate things. This one was fun, because he said, I had this aunt in Ohio, we hardly ever saw her, but when we did see her, she was racist. Okay. Yeah, you know, she would just be talking, and then she'd say racist things. And you would never, like, it's ridiculous. All right, so he's got this racist aunt. The group talks about this for a bit, figures out that the aunt lives, again, in a really white town. She doesn't have a lot of experience with people of color, and she's very, very old. Okay? So this social isolation piece plus age gives them a handy explanation for what they're seeing. Someone else said, look, I was trying to rent an apartment in the South, and I was told that the N-word wouldn't be allowed on the property. So there they blamed, well, that's the South. This study was done in the North, so it was easy to blame the South. And that the person probably lacked formal education, right? They were just managing a property in someplace in the South. They probably didn't have a lot of education. Now, for the record, they had no idea if the person had education or not, but they assumed he must not, and that helped them explain away this racism. Yeah, for our purposes, I don't care if it was meant to be racist or not. right? What I care about is that the people in the conversation heard it as potentially racist, right? And that they explained it away using these characteristics, right? The whole idea of my study is to get away with the deep, dark secrets in the back of our mind, what we secretly mean, what we really intend, and look at what happens in the world. What do we do in the world, whether we're well-intended or not? What do we do? Right? So that's what we're looking at. So whether these things are actually racist in some absolute sense is outside the scope of my study. And what was a little surprising to me is it's clearly things white people see too. They are the ones bringing it up, right? I didn't follow them around and I was like, oh, your neighbor's racist, did you notice? Like, they brought it up, they told me. So like I said, we all can see the problem. That we're pretending we can't is about something else, right? It's not truly lack of information. So they have these handy explanations, but we really can't say for sure how accurate they are. Right? And I would argue, like you're arguing, they're not real in an absolute sense. All right, so a participant saying in her rural hometown, she hears the M word at family gatherings and stuff like that. Again, they decided region. They said being rural, anywhere. So this was Western Pennsylvania. Being rural, that's the problem. Being too old to know better. Then we're here, we've got youth again, a confounding problem. The white teenage lifeguards at the pool kept saying black people couldn't swim, but one of the lifeguards herself was a black person, so it was awkward. The group decides that that is because they haven't yet completed their education, they're too young to know better, and surely they've had bad media exposure, because why not? All right. So these are the kinds of conversations that would happen. We'd have the initiating action, we'd have a bunch of negotiation that would land on these explanations. Right? Now, for my purposes, the explanations they came up with is not the outcome of this interaction. It's not really what the interaction accomplishes. It's just what they talked about. I'm going to show you why the fact that they talked about it in this way really matters. Did I see a hand? We're good? Yeah, they used education in a really weird way. Sometimes it meant things like street starts and travel experience. Sometimes it meant book learning. So it was, again, one of those really stretchy concepts that they could kind of wrap around anything they couldn't get to fit. All right, there were two very unusual ones I just wanted to share with you. One group did say, look, a participant said, look, my sister's husband is from this big Italian family, and they're racist against blacks and gays. That's what the person said. Right? She said, so I don't know if maybe Italians are racist, right? That group immediately rejected that idea, right? Someone's like, no, I know Italian, they're not racist. And they never spoke of it again. So that was a little weird. It's the only one that came up that they didn't attempt to kind of get to know it better, compare it. They were just like, no, Italians are fine, let's not talk about it. So that was unusual, right? Group moved on. And this one was very unusual. So in one of my groups, it's every researcher's nightmare, I got a participant who I believe was potentially mentally ill or otherwise unstable. She shows up to participate in my group. She goes on these long, somewhat incoherent rants about things like black people taking over the White House and putting all the white people in slavery, stuff that was even a step beyond the normal racist stuff I was hearing all the time. It was really, really out there. It was very conspiracy theory based. Her own sentences wouldn't really be complete or make sense. It was a very difficult, confounding issue for my group. She ends up leaving early. So the other group gets a chance to talk about her. So they had to figure out what to do with this lady, right? And you know, I don't know anything about her personally, but her hair was kind of all over the place. We met at night inside and she wore really big dark sunglasses the whole time. Again, she wasn't really coherent and the stuff she was saying was very, very explicitly, aggressively offensive and a little crazy. So the group thought about this. You know, they started with the normal ones we always hear. Maybe she's not very well educated, right? You know, maybe, Pittsburgh area, we have some neighborhoods people never leave, right? They never move around, they stay in their neighborhoods forever, generation after generation. Maybe she's from one of those neighborhoods. They decide clearly she's had overexposure to some kind of bad information because these conspiracy theories she was getting from somewhere, so she'd had too much exposure. They do suggest that perhaps there's a mental illness factor, which I myself believe might be the case. Because of the sunglasses, they thought maybe it was because she was blind. They immediately rejected that. They're like, no, that one doesn't make any sense. All right? Then they decided she had been brainwashed. Then they decided maybe she had been abducted by aliens. And finally, they decided that she wasn't a real person at all. She was an actor that I had chosen and put into the group just to see what they would do, right? This instance of racism was so hard for them to explain. The only explanation they could come up with is that she isn't even human. That's where they had to go to get out of dealing with this extremely explicit form of racism. As incoherent as this woman was, she was clearly working off of a coherent ideology from somewhere, right? She was using someone's information. It was getting a little scrambled somewhere. Yeah, well, there is some of that too. But this wasn't her being mentally ill and creating these theories. This was her being mentally ill and giving us a very skewed version of theories about race that are alive and well in our society. That have very, fully mentally sound people creating websites and sending mail, telling these awful stories. So yes, I think her mental illness played a role in her interactions in the group, but a lot of her beliefs can't be written off as just mental illness. They came from a place. So that's how they handled this. So we do see some deviation in this process, but again, generally speaking, it followed the same pattern over and over again. All right, so hopefully by now you believe me this happened a lot, that it followed a certain very patterned set of characteristics. All right, so here are the things that I kind of take from that. The first thing that I think is really important for us to remember is that this is collective, this is interactive. This is a shared activity, and it's an active one. So where previous research from interviews suggested that whites have a thought, a belief about racism, and they put it into words and give it to the world, right? And then the world takes it. It's a very passive thing, right? This is very active, right? Someone says something and people chew on it and come up with alternate theories and then figure out where they're gonna land together. It's very, very active, and it's very, very shared, right? That to me is important as a sociologist to notice, right? They're working together to identify multiple examples. They're analyzing those examples and coming to conclusions together. Disagreements are allowed, but resolved, right? I didn't have a single incident of someone saying, all right, well, you believe it's lack of education, I'm gonna believe it's something else, right? They came to a shared place at the end of the conversation. That seemed important, okay? The next thing as a sociologist that's really fascinating to me, what they are basically doing is building theories of intersectionality. Do I have any sociology students in the room who know what intersectionality is? Denise knows, come on, tell me. Okay, so looking at overlapping of social locations, right? So I am a white woman, which means I experience all of the ways in which being a woman is treated in my society and all the ways that being white is treated in my society, and they overlap, right? So I have some access to more privilege because of my race, and I lose some access to privilege because of my gender, and I experience both of those things in my daily life, right? So it used to be when we study these issues, we'd look at only one form of oppression or one social location at a time, for simplicity's sake. We realize we really have to remember that they overlap, because if you don't remember that they overlap, it's easy to overlook certain vulnerable groups. So we found that when researchers would talk about gender, they'd talk about gender as if all women were white, right? And we'd be, whoa, wait a minute, no, that's a completely misleading way of looking at this issue. There's a lot of overlap, and we have to look at all the different groups that make up women, right? That's basically what our participants are doing, right? With no training in sociology, they're building these theories of intersectionality, right? They're seeing an individual white person as a mix of their different social locations, right? As a sociologist, I find that fascinating. The people already know how to do this work, right? And then they pin racism to whatever combination makes sense for the data they have, right? So they've got a couple different stories. It seems like they all share a lack of education. So that's the thing they're gonna focus on as the unifying experience or element, right? They're theory building, which I thought was really, really cool. All right, and the whole process is not at all dependent on what the individuals involved believe, right? I had some people who were highly conservative. I had some people who were very liberal and progressive. I had some people who would explicitly say, racism is not a problem. If there's a problem related to race, it's minority's own fault, right? And I had people who would say, look, racism is a real problem and we need to actively address it, right? People of all sorts of beliefs participated in the same process. They all participated in the same process. And that to me, again, is important, because we tend to think if we change people's beliefs, we will change society. But if people behave the same regardless of belief, we have another problem on our hands. So this all seemed to happen regardless of individual belief. But because it happens so much and it's such an active collective process, I do believe that it can shape belief, right? So belief doesn't seem to derail it necessarily, but the fact that we're going through this together is probably shaping us in our relationship to the world in some way, shape, or form. So it's relevant, but in this kind of backward way compared to how we usually think about belief. I teach students what theories of intersectionality is, because from a sociological perspective, it's a useful way to understand the social world. We do have a problem with this, however, and you've probably spotted it already. Their only data is anecdotal data, right? and my budding sociology students know that anecdotal data is very prone to bias. This isn't a systematic study they have of white racism, right? This is like a cousin and an uncle and some guy you saw on the train, right? That is not a good study. So they're doing this theory building off of really bad data, right? So just generally speaking, we would expect them to come to the wrong conclusions. And what really is the problem here is that every single characteristic that they raised to explain racism was an underprivileged social status. Now you may say, look, being in the South isn't underprivileged. That may be the case. For these people it was. They only mentioned it as a negative place to be from, as a less important region in the world, as a backward place, right? So every single one of those characteristics they mentioned was a lower privilege status. When they're talking about the origins of racism, right? And for those of you who have taken sociology of minority groups, we tend to think of racism as being something that the overprivileged group benefits from. So how is it that all of our racists turn out to be underprivileged people? It's a very suspicious little trick that's happened here. Things like being too young or too old, not the dominant age group in society, right? Being from an isolated region or community, not the important central connected regions and communities. Being low education, not the educational elite, right? Having few opportunities to travel, not the worldly and well-connected. What they do every single time is they explain racism as an example of a lack of privilege. That is a remarkable accomplishment, right? It's the exact opposite of what it is in real life, right? And they did it without even meaning to, without setting out to accomplish that goal, right? So the outcome of these negotiations is not identifying various causes of racism. I don't think that's the outcome. I think that's what they talked about, but I don't think that's the outcome. I think the outcome is they managed through these interactions to link racism to a lack of privilege. Remember we said, how is it that they say racism doesn't matter, yet they know all these racists? Well, they took the racist and they linked them to a lack of privilege. So then racism doesn't matter, right? They took the power out of racism. Of course, not in real life, right? Just in their heads. So despite knowing dozens of racists, racism becomes associated with marginalized, not dominant social locations, right? It suggests that racist beliefs themselves are harmless in some way, or that they're only held by individuals with relatively less power. I even had someone explicitly say it. Well, don't worry about it. Less educated people are more racist, but they don't vote, so it doesn't matter, right? So they very explicitly are saying, you don't have to care about this, because we've figured out that it's a problem of lack of privilege. It delinks statements and beliefs from any kind of broader system of inequality, and it reinforces that fundamental idea that racism isn't a problem at all, right? It's like magic, right? They took mention of a racist and they turned it into confirmation that racism doesn't matter. And I would bet money that not a single one of them knew they were doing it, right? I have myself participated in conversations like this. I've seen sociology classes intentionally do this, right? How does education impact racist ideology, right? We encourage these conversations. But it turns out in everyday interaction, it may have this very important negative impact of hiding the very thing that should be revealed when we look at racism, right? So Bonilla Silva wrote a book that was Racism Without Racists, because he says, look, we have racism all over our society, and yet nobody feels that they themselves are racist. What I found is that we have a ton of racists, right? I had 86 racists. I only talked to people for a minute without anybody being able to talk to me about racism, right? That you can be racist and not actually be tied to a system of inequality in any way, shape, or form because of these narrative moves we make in our conversations. So this was just fascinating work for me to do because it did not go the way I had expected it to go. All right, so again, this kind of race talk accomplishes that outcome regardless of the beliefs of the people in the group. So again, I had participants who were adamantly against racism, very well informed, shared about taking action in their lives that was very explicitly anti-racist action. They themselves were more racially integrated, right? All the things we would think would make a difference. And they participated in these conversations exactly the same way, right? So it's important how we engage in conversation about race, right? Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about is whether we can interrupt the pattern. So in my research, that was one of the areas. There were other sort of patterns that I looked at, and I did find over and over again across all of my groups, they tended to talk about similar things in similar ways and accomplish similar outcomes. So I was really desperate to find examples of when people did something differently. And for this particular sort of initiating action, negotiation, and outcome, I had only one instance one instance where someone did it differently. So I'd like to share that with you and then give you some tips on how we can maybe derail this aspect of race talk. So this is the story. Yep. All right, so this is Paul. He's going to discuss a time that an important businessman was coming to his restaurant. He says, "My restaurant was busy that day. I had his table set up. He was bringing a party of 8, all from Europe. I had another party of 8 celebrating a guy's 85th birthday. My restaurant was in this little town. So he walked in with the president of Coca-Cola. They were dressed in a couple of $1,000 suits, $1,500 pairs of shoes. There was all this class about them. The president was a really good-looking, tall, big black man dressed to the hilt. So I'm being introduced, and at the same time that I'm walking up to shake his hand, this man who is celebrating his 85th birthday stands up and says, 'Who let that big black M-word in here?' Loud as could be. Everyone stopped. It was lunch. Every table is taken, and everyone stopped." So that's the story he shares about a white racist. Now, based on what we've seen already, what would we expect this group to do next? If they follow the pattern. Yeah. All right, so he's old, definitely old. We're going to maybe see that one. What else might they pin this on? All right, maybe he's uneducated, small little town, right? We can go the whole region, rural community. All right, we're set up, right? It's the same setup we've seen over and over again. Right? Someone jumps in. Were they drunk? Right? I'd not seen that one before, but maybe they're too out of their mind, right? You know what Paul says? No, they weren't drunk. They were racist. Very racist. Completely different than what we've seen before, right? Completely different. Ian says, all right, but did he do that because he was an older gentleman, and with age? Paul interrupts him and says, he did that because he was racist, right? They talk about, Paul tries to tell the story again. Ian interrupts and says, but did he think that nobody would? Paul says he was racist, and he was big in the town, right? The waitstaff lived in this town, and they were horrified that I'd speak up to this guy. But it was so offensive. In the end, it did hurt my business, right? This is completely different than what we saw before. Because instead of saying, yeah, this 85-year-old guy, not important, racism doesn't matter, because he was just like on the margins of society, right? He said, no, he was racist, he was big in the town, he had a position of privilege, and that is where racism comes from, right? It's completely different than the normal patterned response. That very sometimes good faith effort to understand racism better, that was getting us to this place where racism seemed to be about lacking privilege, he's saying no. Turns out the thing that our white racists have had in common all along is being white, is being in a privileged enough position that you could get away with saying that stuff, right? And no one in 8 focus groups got to that place except this guy. Yeah, I did have a few people who occasionally said things that were really unusual, and often they had actually some personal experience, like they'd been in an interracial marriage or something that explained it. I did not study whys. I didn't get to the meaning of why people said the things they say, so I can't really answer. This guy said many things throughout the conversation that suggested he actually has done a few real anti-racist things in his life. Like here, he didn't mess up his business by accident. He knew exactly what he was doing. So he seemed to be someone who truly takes an anti-racist stance, but I didn't really investigate that. This guy is the owner, and he did tolerate a lot of sort of everyday racism. He took a stand in this one instance because he felt it was too appalling. Right, so in this instance, it's easy for Paul to be like, no, he was big in the town. That's why he could act that way. But if we went back and looked at any of our other examples, there is a reason why they can act that way. There's some way that whiteness protects them from consequences. And that's what's been completely missing from all of our focus groups analysis, right? Nobody said, oh yeah, she's white. All the white people in her town are going to totally endorse that viewpoint because she is privileged in that town, in that she is the dominant racial group. Like, nobody did that. This is the first place we see it, and you're right, it's a little easy here because he's like actually big in the town in a lot of ways. It's a little harder to say that for the unemployed, guy who lives 3 houses down, but we could say it. The point is we don't even try. It's certainly true. They were out of towners. They weren't going to bring in a lot of business in the coming months and years. So he, by siding with the powerful visiting team, wasn't necessarily setting himself up for a lot of economic success in the future. So yeah, he was clearly wowed by these guys, which maybe did make it easier. But again, my study isn't really about the racism that happens, right? It's about how we talk about the racism we experience. So all of those things we can speculate. It's very interesting, but I wouldn't have any real answers. Yeah, I don't know. It sounds like it's a really small town, so I don't imagine there were a lot of options, right? And this guy, just from my little interaction, seemed like a really good guy, so I imagine people liked working with him. But yeah, I can't really speculate to the nature of the racist actions. simply how we process those experiences when we talk with each other. That's really what I focused on. Yeah, I mean, that was what the original research suggested, right? Is that so long as someone's worse than I am, I'm not responsible and I don't have to do anything about it. This definitely would feed that dynamic. I would say even somebody who desperately wanted to address their own privilege, who was actively doing things to live a truly anti-racist existence, would still engage in the conversation the same way. So intentionality may be there, even the majority of the time. What I find very disturbing is it's not required, right? You don't have to want to protect privilege in order to do it by accident. That to me is an even bigger problem, right? Because if it was simply changing people's minds about it, I think we stand a chance. If they're engaging in behavior they're not aware of and that is counter to their good beliefs, that's an even harder fix. So yeah, I think you're probably right, but it may not be a necessary component of this. All right, so in terms of interrupting the pattern ourselves, right, one thing we can do is begin to notice when people are doing this, when they're dismissing racism as being about a lack of privilege, right? Start to notice when you hear it. When someone says, oh, a person's racist, but, and then they give you a lower privilege status that they want you to focus on. Begin to notice when that's happening. And like I said, I've done this myself because I do think things like education level have some impact on how racist ideology works. But we have to be really careful because we risk reinforcing this idea that racism is a lower privileged status when actually it, of course, comes from a higher privileged status. Right? Pay special attention for age, region of the country, media exposure, those came up a lot. Once you've noticed it, begin to identify how that dominant racial status gives white people the privilege to say these things. I think that's a really good place to start interrupting the pattern, right? It's not necessarily that we have to explain why they believe racist things, but why do they feel they can say them out loud, right? It's because they're in a privileged racial position that protects them from the consequences of saying them aloud. In our current political situation, that is not hard to see, alive and well every day, right? So point out that whiteness is often the most obvious and privileged thing that whites have in common. So that probably is the thing that's explaining the behavior that we're seeing. And then I suggest practicing what you might say and do in response to racist remarks and actions in the future. I did have one group that got to talking and said, I no longer laugh at racist jokes, right? I never believed in racist jokes. I always thought they were wrong. They always made me uncomfortable, but I would laugh a little bit because I didn't know what to do. And then I realized laughing is endorsing. I might as well be telling the jokes myself. So I learned not to laugh, and I learned to say, I don't think that joke is appropriate, here's why. And the other group members were like, that's really helpful because I laugh and I don't want to. It makes me uncomfortable, right? And they talked about that. So what do we do? How do we handle it, right? So we can begin learning strategies for navigating these kinds of conversations. We can teach them to each other, and we can begin having the tools we need to stand up and interrupt the pattern, right? We can all do that. If you don't know a lot about it, I suggest that you do some reading. Brainstorm ways to respond. Definitely read up on the topic. There's a ton of scholars, particularly scholars of color, that do this work. Very accessible stuff, really interesting stuff. You can learn all about it and you can develop these skills to respond. And again, not just with white people, but in any environment in which this is happening. And then if someone shares a story with you, because it's gonna happen, it happened 86 times to me, someone's gonna say, oh, my neighbor is so racist, right? Teach them how to respond differently. Teach them how to talk about that as an instance of privilege and how to sort of lift up racism as an actual real thing instead of pushing it down and dismissing it. Right? We can learn to do it ourselves. We can teach people how to do it, and we can, in fact, interrupt the pattern. Okay? All right, I'm done. Any questions? It's a very long story. We believe, actually, what happened is slavery, this triangle trade slavery that came to the Americas, that it was this big economic enterprise that required the significant violent oppression of millions of people. And you can't get away with that if you're a good citizen or if you're a good Christian, because you can't treat people that way. So racism was a way to take people and turn them into something else that you could get away with mistreating. So by saying, well, this race is a lesser species than white people, then they were no longer bound by the sort of moral code of civilized society or of Christianity. And that was an excuse so they could continue to have slaves, so they can continue to profit. So that's what we believe is the origin of modern race-based ideology. It would help if I knew more about the sort of personal belief system of the person involved. I do think that it could be a way of saying, if we've created an incarceration system to penalize black men, and it is also penalizing whites, it's really gotten out of hand. That's one way he could have meant it. Now, if he's a white supremacist, he could have meant it, how dare white men go to jail ever because they're so superior. That could have been what he meant. But not knowing him, perhaps the argument was that a system that has to be that comprehensive and that brutal that it even impacts more privileged groups is a wildly out of hand system. But I don't really know what he's thinking, right? I haven't met him. Yeah, we are so bad at talking about race constructively in this country that we almost always immediately go off the rails. Like someone is trying to make an interesting point or someone's trying to answer a question they sincerely don't know how to answer. And we immediately fall into these scripts that are damaging and misleading and reinforce racial ideology. So they're very challenging conversations to have. The people, it was Western Pennsylvania is where I did the study. So what I'd like to do now is go back to Western Pennsylvania, do another set of focus groups in the post-Trump era. I currently can't afford, right? It's interesting to see what they do. I currently can't afford the little gift cards that I give them to participate, so it's on hold. But if I can figure out a way to get myself some cash, I'm going to go and do it again and see if there's a big difference in how we talk about race. Yeah, one of the things I like about this particular line of research is we don't have to get all tangled up in what people really meant. That's really messy territory, right? Often we don't even know what we really meant, or what we meant yesterday is different than what we'd mean today if we said the same thing. That's very valid and we need to study that, and that's important in the world. But I find that to be a very difficult place to live as an academic. That for me, if we can live in what is what you just said accomplish, what does it do, right? That to me is something we can grapple with. And sometimes very well-meaning people say things, especially like all this stuff with sexual assault, they say something that they're trying to contribute in a meaningful way to the conversation. They maybe don't mean anything dismissive to any groups, but the way that they say it contributes to an ideology or a pattern way of talking or a structure that is in fact damaging. And so to get away from, how dare you, you're a terrible person, how dare you mean that? People are like, I didn't mean that, why are you getting so offended, right? Step away from all that. I mean, like, well, when you said it, here's what it did. Here's what it did to our conversation. Here's what it did to my ability to talk to you. Regardless of what you meant, like, here's what it did. That to me is just a much more productive place for teaching, for academic work. Like I said, people need to figure out what everyone's got in the deep corners of their mind. It's not a good gig for me. I'm really much more comfortable talking about, now that you put it in the world, it's no longer yours. It's no longer about your heart, right? Now it's ours, and it's about how things work in the social world. And that has parameters, and that has a reality to it that we need to be able to address. Yeah, so the other big area of this study is when people bring up people of color to make a point. So they bring up Obama, or they bring up the security guard at their office, or whoever the person of color is that they know, to prove some kind of point about racism. It is similar kind of initiating action, negotiation, outcome kind of dynamics to it. It very much is the tokenistic fallacy, where we have one example of something, like a token person in a position, and we believe that that means it's equal for everybody, right? This sort of strange overgeneralization. They did do it a lot, and they often did it similar to this, where you'd mention a person of color, you'd mention a person of color, I'd mention a person of color, and we'd look at like all three of them together to come to some conclusion. And unfortunately, one of the big things that I found, and I can share my data with you, but they would have this way of talking about blackness that when they were looking at people who weren't successful, they would say things like they're 100% black or they're New York black. And when they were talking about successful people of color, they would say, he's white to me. So blackness stayed associated with really negative, stereotyped, racist thinking. And anyone who was that sort of token success story, you see just race be wiped away. I have one exchange about Obama where they start talking about how he's the first black president, and then they talk, well, he's really mixed race, and then they say he's international, and then they say, well, he's really the typical American, and then finally someone says, he's the hot dog of American presidents. He's so successful, he passes like through whiteness into like food. Like that's how far from blackness he had to go for them to kind of come to terms with this person. So yeah, we definitely see them grapple with that, and that was probably like another third of my research was that exact issue. Yeah, so I do believe in sort of a grassroots approach. Her question was, if we don't have access to people in power, how are we really going to make a difference, right? If all we have access to is each other. I do think how we talk to each other matters. I mean, I devoted all my research time to studying it. I do think it matters. I think that is, like in your sociology classes, you talk about social construction. Well, that's a thing we have to show up and do every day. And talk is one of the big places we do it. So I do think we can make a difference by changing the way we talk to each other. And if enough of us do that, enough days in a row, things start to shift. So I think it's important. But you also can access people in power. You vote, You can call and write congressional representatives. You can access people in power. We have a system that's designed to give us some influence. Not as much influence as I personally would like, but definitely we can engage at both levels. And we can organize ourselves into groups that have more power. The way you see corporate interest organized into lobbying entities, right? We can organize ourselves so we can become more than just one person. But we're not going to organize well if we can't even talk to each other well. So I do think just looking at the level of how we interact with the people around us is an excellent part of the solution. Yeah, so in American history, whites have been given the option of seeing themselves as raceless, as not having any meaningful race or racial identity. Then there's white power, white supremacy, that says, no, actually, we kind of like that we're white, we're going to use that as a tool. But a lot of white people are kind of, slightly to the left of that, and they see themselves as normal, as neutral, right? So they don't see themselves as having a collective white identity, and it's really easy for them to see all the ways they're different from other types of white people. Maybe by ethnicity, well, you're Italian, you're Irish. Maybe by job, right? You're a steel mill worker, I'm a college professor. Maybe by religion, lots of different ways. Because for the most part, whites are socially isolated from people of color. So we know a lot about white people because we're in their world all the time, and we don't know a lot about others. So we see ourselves as varied and diverse and different and interesting, right? And people of color are all similar to each other in these big kind of clunky ways that turn out to be completely untrue and that support racial inequality. So you have white supremacy, a very pro-whiteness, white power stance. I would say, and this might change in a year or two, but right this second, more whites think they're neutral, normal, raceless, in a way that's really problematic because you can't see how you benefit from a system you don't really think you're a part of. Yeah, no, I can't, and I can't predict the future. I'm a little suspicious of the new desire to understand if you're Neanderthal. It's like jumping back before race. Like that leads me to believe that to the extent we keep racism alive, whiteness will find a way to persevere. We may even see Hispanic identity be relabeled as whiteness, the way Irish came here and it was like, are they white or not? Okay, yes, they're white. We may see whiteness expand to include different groups of people as demographics change. It's a very rubbery, racism is very rubbery. We stretch it around whatever we need to serve a purpose. Yeah, exactly. And usually at the heart of it, there's a true economic power structure that's very relevant and very keen to defend itself. So yeah, I don't think it's going to be as simple as everyone's like, shoot, we're all mixed race. I don't see that as what happens next. I hope it is, but yeah, I'm not thinking we're going that way. Thank you guys for having me. I appreciate it.